So this session is looking at how we support autistic learners in the classroom and what specifically research says about supporting autistic learners in the classroom. So I work in our postgraduate education courses. More specifically, I work on our MA education courses. Like Janice, my background is in special educational needs and inclusion. One of my other backgrounds is in psychology. So I'll be talking about what research says about what works for autism, as well as sort of the more practical elements. But to give sort of the overview at the start, first thing, autism is complicated. Autism presents differently from person to person. So there isn't one, here's the one approach or set of approaches and it'll work for everyone. The other major issue that can arise is that from a research perspective, evidence requires single interventions to be carried out at a time in order to be able to evaluate them. The norm in relation to supporting learners in the classroom for teachers is to be trying a range of things, which means that from a research perspective, from a publication perspective, it's hard to say this is what works because actually this child was being subject to 3 or 4 interventions. If there's any impact, it could be any or all of them, or it could be the interaction between them. So being able to identify and say this specifically works is very complicated. There are broader issues around it as well that we will come to as we go through the slides. So the format for the talk, I'll talk about what autism is, how it is defined, what current terminology is used. We'll talk about how it relates to the code of practice. Again, linking back to what Janice said about the areas of need in the code of practice, autism is one of those complex conditions that potentially hits all 4 areas of need. It is not, okay, it's just cognition and learning. It is potentially all of them. And we will look at the interventions that are commonly used to support autistic learners and specifically the evidence to support them. I am actually going to, as I often do, skip forward though, just to highlight a quote, a relatively recent quote about what is known, what is not known, but also what is available, I guess, on the market to support autistic learners. And these are not necessarily educational ones. So a Westminster sort of government-focused commission on autism, what we know, what we don't know, what's currently happening, highlighted a range of treatments or interventions offered in and beyond the classroom. Autistic people, families, often parents, have been offered treatments such as crystal therapy. Does anyone know what that is? Dangle crystals. Ear candles. So ear candles. They are, whatever they are, vitamins. Okay, that one's relatively, we all know what vitamins are. Spiritual intervention. Do we have, we then have exorcism later. So it's theoretically a version of the same thing. Aromatherapy. Chelation, kind of bloodletting, as I recall. Juice plus diet. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy. That at least sounds scientific, doesn't it? I guess. We have exorcism. Stem cell transplants. Again, that sounds scientific. Exposure therapy. We have, and again, bear in mind this is a specific quote, so including slapping is someone else's words, not mine. Rerum, which I believe is another diety thing. Acupuncture. Defeat autism now therapy. Bleach. Yeah, bleach. Turpentine, and many more. None of the above interventions are evidenced autism interventions. Some are dangerous, and their use could result in serious harm. So when we talk about interventions and support for autism, one of the concerns as a researcher and someone who's worked with autistic individuals and autistic families is that there is a lot of, so that is a very gentler word than I might use if I were feeling particularly cynical, but there's a load of stuff out there. There are, obviously there are schools that are concerned with teachers, but there are also, families and parents who may be looking for any sort of thing that might work. And therefore it is concerning and frustrating that when we talk about what research there is to support what we might call more conventional approaches to supporting autism, there is no simple, here is the conventional classroom-based alternative that works, stick with this and you'll be fine. If we had that, these things would not be as prominent or as successful in, I guess, making money as they are. Is this surprising to people? There are other, this is not a comprehensive list. My favourite one that doesn't sit on this list, what might it be? Any guesses? Probably not, because it's a weird one. Dolphin therapy. Anyone come across dolphin therapy? No? So you basically take your child to Florida for a few weeks to spend time with dolphins. It's, on its own, that sounds a bit mad, I guess, but it does sit within the broader range of animal therapies that are, assistive animals, supportive animals, creatures that they can engage with that are less stressful and they can form bonds, form attachments, that sort of thing. I'm not saying it's not useful or it couldn't have an effect. It's just really expensive compared to, you could just do equine therapy. You don't need to go to Florida for it. But, go to Florida for a few weeks and spend time with dolphins is kind of an example of that's really horribly expensive. I've known children who've done it, which is why I can talk about it. It's a bit mad. Anyway, so what is autism? So we'll start with, the commonly identified idea nowadays, one that you might be most likely to come across, is the idea that autistic learners present with what is called a triad of impairment. 3 identifiable, distinct but overlapping areas that they have difficulties with. So social and emotional difficulties, language and communication difficulties, and flexibility of thought, issues around that. So again, in terms of the sort of 4 areas of the code of practice that Janice mentioned that we will be coming back to later, these kind of hit every base. This is kind of this is a condition that highlights the need for other conditions to be called specific learning difficulties, because this is a global one. It kind of potentially impacts every aspect of an individual rather than just being, it is just an issue with reading or writing or with maths or with attention or whatever. It is potentially everything. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association. So this is the sort of document or set of documents that clinical and educational psychologists use, calls autism in its latest edition. It says the range of areas identified: persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. So it's not just, they don't get on in school, but they're fine at home. It is also characterized by restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests or activities, as manifested by at least 2 of the following: stereotyped or repetitive motor movement. What is the classic autistic motor movement? Yeah, flapping and stimming. It's again where you get into difficulties in the sense that it is common, but it is not that every individual who is autistic does it. Their use of objects or speech may be highly restricted. They may have fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or scope. And they also tend to be longer lasting, which can mean, normal. Neurotypical children have fixations or interests, but they tend to come and go. An individual with autism may have a fixation that they fixated long enough that it now makes them seem immature. Anyone know any classic, common, trait specifically? Specific one? Thomas bloody Tank Engine. I have been to Thomas the Tank Engine world, so I don't mean I was there on purpose. It's in Japan. Why are you here? What is this? But yeah, Thomas the Tank Engine is one of those weird, common fixations for whatever reason. They can be hypo or hyperreactive to sensory input. So they may be oversensitive or undersensitive. They may mix or not experience sensory elements in the same way as us. Or they may have unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Obviously, symptoms must be present early in life. It is supposed to be a global condition. It is a lifelong condition. It's not something that suddenly appears, despite what some research spuriously claims. And obviously, issues cannot be explained by another condition or diagnosis. Autism exists as a spectrum, as a continuum. So, they're not all the same. Interestingly, so DSM-5, there is a key distinction between DSM-5 and previous iterations, which is, so are people familiar with Asperger's? It doesn't exist anymore. It is not a question that it doesn't exist anymore. It is just that it's just been folded into the general autistic spectrum condition as a single diagnosis rather than the previous iteration, which would have been autism and Asperger's or high functioning as separate, implied, because if it was separate, it implies that there might be a different basis or causation, whereas autistic spectrum condition, including Asperger's, the notion is, yes, high functioning, low functioning, they're all under the one umbrella. But yeah, it's a spectrum, it's a continuum. The range of severity varies markedly. Asperger's was, as we said, what would previously have been called high functioning. High functioning, of course, is a curious term. Why might that be? Yes?
It might not be that person's high functioning, or it's high masculine.
Well, what is interesting is that high functioning tends to mean high functioning in one area. It tends to mean cognitively high functioning. It doesn't tend to mean, oh, right, yes, they don't have any sensory issues or social issues. It is just that actually, for inclusive terms, that they'll probably be fine in a mainstream school. They might still have exactly the same levels of social issues. They're more likely to be, or much less likely to be non-verbal. But yeah, it is literally sort of high functioning tends to mean cognitive or sort of in educational terms. Statistics for the UK, and again, these are according to the National Autistic Society, 1 in every 100 people. So not quite 1 per classroom, but certainly a couple per school. It is a lifelong condition that seems to affect males more than females. Is this surprising? I say to him, I'm just realising an entire classroom made entirely of females. For better or for worse, males have tended to dominate the population of those identified as having a special education Yeah.
Is it just due to, well, I think it's due to research, because there's more research with males than females.
That is an element to it. There is the glorious general idea that the Y chromosome is an element that means that males are more susceptible to this and that and the other. There is, yes, research does focus and has historically focused on autistic boys. The first research, the development of autism as a specific category was based on analysis and diagnosis of boys. That isn't to say girls aren't autistic. And in terms of severity, the difference tends to be a bit more marked for less severe autism, in the sense that what might have been called classic autism, severe autism, girls don't tend to be underdiagnosed because there tends to be, right, yes, this clearly warrants a diagnosis of autism. It looked like autism. Whereas with the more able, that seems to be where girls might go undetected, where they are high functioning. And or they may be diagnosed with something else. Research tells us that autistic women are apparently, and again, this is relatively recent research, I'm saying apparently, they are better at masking, at hiding the sort of social difficulties that come with autism. Boys are not so good at. But the sort of masking and the impact of it does tend to mean that they will have had a range of other diagnoses before they finally come to a diagnosis with autism. So ADHD, anxiety disorders are unfortunately a common pathway to potentially an ultimate diagnosis of autism. One of the illogical questions I ask is, who is most likely to have a special educational need? One answer might be boys, but the other answer, unfortunately, is children who already have special needs. So a child with one category of need is more likely to be comorbid or have another need compared to neurotypical population. So autism and ADHD, autism and dyslexia, autism and dyspraxia, it is common to have more than one, unfortunately. We have some common myths about autism. A myth. There is, an element of truth in them, but they are exaggerated or not entirely accurate. Children with autism never make eye contact, show affection, or smile. It is true that that not liking or not engaging with eye contact is a characteristic of autism, but it is not true of all of them, and it is not that they never make it, it is just that they're less likely to. How they show affection may be different, in the same way that how we all show affection, probably a bit different from each other. Inside a child with autism is a normal child, a genius, waiting to emerge. This is a particularly challenging one for parents. If, when they realize at a certain point that their child is neurotypical, neuroatypical, neurodiverse, how do they respond to that? Do they come to a point where they accept that, or do they have to still cling to the idea that there is a neurotypical or normal child that may at some point emerge? In communication terms, and again, this is more geared towards classic autism. Children with autism don't speak, but they could if they wanted to. Sounds really judgmental, doesn't it? Children with autism don't relate to peers and adults and don't want friends. Again, They certainly, social interaction is challenging for them. Doesn't mean they don't relate or don't have an understanding of it. And whether they do or don't want friends, well, it varies. Children with autism are manipulative and selfish, and or lazy. But that's more of a general myth about special needs. Autism is just an emotional disorder. Autism can be outgrown. And it's the mother's fault. Autism is the mother's fault. Are we surprised by that? So this particular term, the refrigerator mother, the cold, unemotional, unsupportive mother, is the reason why children become autistic. This sort of 1950s notion around social development and attachment. As a father, it means at least that things aren't my fault, but this at least is one of the ones that has pretty much left, but is worth reminding ourselves what certain starting points are and how far we hopefully have come. In terms of education in the UK at the moment, as Janice said, schools are expected to follow the Code of Practice, and the Code of Practice does identify 4 areas, and autism can relate to all 4 of them. So they will obviously have communication and interaction needs, potentially. They will certainly have cognition and learning needs. They may have social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. And they may have sensory and or physical needs, so primarily, but not always, sensory more than physical. And again, often but not always, just to add to the complexity. So in terms of communication and interaction, they can have difficulties in understanding and using speech, how much they talk, how much they don't talk, how well they understand what they're told, the extent to which they understand or recognize or appreciate gestures and other non-linguistic forms of communication. Eye contact, again, as I said, it's a myth, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an element of it that has a certain truth on certain occasions, that they may not desire or engage with it, and that may prove challenging in terms of neurotypical children and staff making assumptions about, okay, that child isn't looking at me, that might have particular meaning. Tone of voice. Their own tone of voice may be, I guess, unconventional. The extreme version is sort of robotic, is the term used. And they obviously may not understand that tone of voice has a particular meaning. Language can also be an issue. They may be over-literal. They may not understand sort of more metaphoric or ambiguous language. In terms of cognition, in terms of thinking, there are a number of theories that have been espoused to try and explain and understand how they do or don't think. Baron Cohen in particular pioneered the idea that one of the key characteristics of autism is they have a lack of theory of mind, that mind blindness is what it may also be called. The idea that they don't recognize and understand that other people have independent minds and thought processes that are separate from them. Does that make sense to people? And this is within the context that a theory of mind is something that a normal child develops the idea that what I know and think is separate from what you know and think. It's an interesting theory, but it is a controversial, but it is a critique theory as well. Other theories look broadly at what cognitive sciences call executive functioning, sort of higher order attentional mental processes, and that there are issues in relation to how things are organized, basically. How the frontal lobe of the brain sort of processes and prioritizes information and responses and behavior as a result of it. It is another interesting one, but again, in terms of evidence, there is not substantial neuroscientific evidence that say that they have distinct neurological processes or neurological differences from the neurotypical population. The last key theory here is monotropism. So sort of the basic idea is that neurotypical individuals are capable of keeping multiple things in mind, and we do fixate on things, but we are capable of multitasking, of thinking about multiple things, keeping them in mind, whereas the autistic experience and brain is more, right, I can fixate and think about one thing and that at a time, and I do that quite strongly. But it's based on what I'm interested in. If I'm interested in, I'm very interested in it, to the unfortunate exclusion of other things. Moving on then to the third area of need, social, emotional, and mental health. Yes, autistic individuals may find it hard to develop social relationships. Not that they can't, but it is more challenging. Turn-taking, complex conversations, sharing, talking about things that aren't their primary area of interest may be challenging. Not always, but maybe. Going back to an earlier point, there, in terms of mental health needs, high level of comorbidity correlation between autism and anxiety. They experience anxiety at a higher rate than the neurotypical. And again, particularly in females. Yes, this may not, unfortunately, always be readily apparent. Potentially covering all four areas of need, they can, of course, have sensory and or physical needs. So sensory elements are a common but not definitive characteristic of autism. They may be oversensitive or undersensitive. They may seek particular sensations, or they may experience mixed sensitivity, sort of experiencing one sense through another. And they may well experience sensory overload. Bearing in mind, sort of a school classroom is not a simple, complex, calm environment. So this needs to be considered in terms of visual aspects, in terms of sound, in terms of clothing. It can get really complicated. One of the other ones, sensory issues that an autistic child may have, this is probably more of a parent than a school thing. Food. Yeah, they may have a particular aversion to particular textures, and or they may also just have particular fixations or routines that work for them, but may not necessarily always be easy in terms of, okay, I want this type of food and I want to eat it in this order, in this way, presented in this particular, can be fun. Meal times can be fun. All right, there's that slide again. Ear candles. It's curious, each time I come to this slide, I do look at them and go, which one horrifies me most? And it does change, because they're all weird and potentially worrying in their own way. In terms of, whether we call them interventions or strategies, so this is, I'm not going to talk through all of these, but this is just to give you an idea that there is, there are a lot of particular areas that have been explored in terms of how autistic individuals can be supported in education in classrooms. We have general strategies. These will be the type you'll tend to find in sort of more general teacher training advice or local authority or local council sort of advice type documentations. We have cognitive behavioural approaches, and those are primarily ABA and TEACH. We have communication focused approaches, which is primarily PECS, if we've heard of that. And then in terms of social focused approaches, the main program that is researched is our social stories. These three are the most sort of common researched interventions. The one slight issue with them is kind of, unfortunately, a variation on this. Often the people who are conducting research around these interventions also use them and sell them. So if a person is promoting and saying this research shows that this particular approach works and I'm making money for that, there is always a little cynical voice in your head. Does the research really says this, or are you just picking what you want to be able to make more money from? General classroom strategies. Standard differentiation in terms of, we'll get onto that in a later slide. Teacher assistant support in its different formats, whether that is common one-to-one support, full-time or part-time, whether that is having a teaching assistant working with a small group or working with the larger classroom to allow the teacher to spend more time with the individual or with a small group. Having headphones, having screens around the child. How does that sound? Does that sound inclusive, segregative? One of the issues with some of these things is that it can sound really segregative, but if it can actually meet a sensory need. A classroom is a very sensory, noisy or rich environment. So it may be that they need headphones to regulate. It may need, they may, those screens hopefully are there to help them. It may, unfortunately, have negative social consequences, but it is for individuals and children and parents and teachers to sort of figure out what works best for a child. Visual reminders and visual timetables are absolutely common. And the great and glorious and vague and generic ICT. Give them a tablet or a laptop and they can be doing stuff and it'll be fine. And sometimes they are, but it's kind of, as a strategy, it's pretty vague and difficult to nail down. In terms of differentiation, how do you present and lay out the material? How large of a font do you use? What language do you use? What level of complexity are you confident that the child will be able to engage with? How long do you give them to read instructions? And or is the teaching assistant to relay and reinforce that? Do you have multisensory aids? Do you have multisensory presentation, text and speech, stuff like that? Breaking down tasks into simpler components, again, easier said than done and easier with a teaching assistant with one-to-one support. The classic, utilising student interest. If a student is interested in trains, then let them do a project on trains, which can have a value, but might be hard to work in to every single subject. We're doing Romans, today, this semester, Romans didn't have trains. Oh well. Small group work is one of the other commonly used strategies, or just in terms of where they're placed in the classroom if they're not kind of screened off. And generally expectations around the quantity of work or how quickly they will produce stuff. These, as I said, are the general non-specific strategies that may be used to support a learner with autism or that is presumed to be on the spectrum. It is hard to say, again, how much impact any individual one of them will have, because they have different needs, they're not all the same, but also it is difficult because often, a teacher will not just be doing one of these at a time, because that would be odd. They will use their own judgment to figure out which selection of things they use. But that means that as a researcher, I can't just say, right, this is the best way to do it, because we have 500 teachers with an autistic child in their classroom. They're all doing a range of different things, and the evidence base that they would produce wouldn't make it easy for me to say these are the things that work. Cognitive and behavioural approaches then are the dominant type of specific strategies. And these mostly have come from America. We have ABA, which is Applied Behaviour Analysis, and TEACH, which we'll get to. But starting with sort of behavioural basis, and it is very behaviourally oriented. It is about understanding the basis for behaviour, the consequences, and trying to build and shape and reinforce the behaviours we want. The approach basically takes a behaviourist view. What if there is a negative or unappealing behaviour? What precedes it? What triggers it? And what is the consequence that, for whatever reason, perpetuates it? And ABA follows from this sort of, we're looking at identifying and producing relatively simple behaviours that we then build up into more complex areas. So they start very slow. It is very intense, very behaviourally oriented. Lots of, yes, in the specific term, discrete trial training. So lots of individual, relatively simple tasks that you get the child to engage in, to build up and build up and build up to change to more complex, substantial educational outcomes. So yeah, ABA, based on behavioural principles, involves substantial one-to-one support and based on discrete trial training, which is a rewards-based system to reinforce and produce what is termed errorless learning, building up to more complex tasks or skills. ABA is the default used in America. There is a big market for it, and unsurprisingly, it is critiqued because of that. There is evidence for it. One of the complications is that the evidence for it is about being used on a one-to-one basis, which means then applying it in a classroom setting, the evidence isn't for that, because that's not what it is. That's not what the basis of it is. The autistic community also do not have a positive view of it, and sort of view that it focuses on obedience and normalization, that it is, again, trying to cure something rather than understand and, where appropriate, appreciate it. A similar, though slightly different program, TEACH, which is Treatment and Education of Autistic and Communication Handicapped Children. Very highly structured, very sort of visual, very organised is the broad approach that is taken. Obviously, this is an example of an example of a child and it being applied successfully in a normal classroom environment, and certainly seems quite compatible with primary education. Not necessarily so sure it would work so well once you get into secondary. It is less behaviourally oriented, but not non-behavioural. Um, one of the other common communication strategies used, and the examples aren't unique in the sense that you'll have seen it in the previous one, PECS. So picture exchange communication system, the use of visual symbols to communication signifier a desire or need. PECS is a symbol-based system. It can be considered a simplistic system in the sense that have a sign for what you want, but it is formatted, and the potential is there for it to be a comprehensive communication system to produce complex communication, sentences, paragraphs, not just single symbols for single ideas. So there is the scope for it to be used as a comprehensive and rich alternative to spoken or written language. That doesn't, of course, mean that that's how it is necessarily used in schools. And one of the challenges is that, yes, finding research evidence can be complicated if it is used in schools in a more simplistic manner. And there's also been a long debate, but it can be linked back to longer debates in relation to visual and hearing impairments about what we want, what we encourage, and what we might be worried about if we are over-reliant on this. If we are over-reliant on this, will it mean that they won't develop what language skills they have? Again, feeding back to that potential early myth that they can talk, they just decide not to. So yes, it is widely used, and one of the key ideas going for PECS in particular is that it is non-specialist in the sense that if a young child comes up to you with one of these symbols, you don't need specialised knowledge to know what they want. Like, okay, it's a picture of a toilet. I don't need a year of training to know what that means. Might not mean I want to do it, but there we go. So again, we are aware that it is commonly used. We are aware that it can be used to support complex interaction and complex communications, but the amount of evidence that it is used in that way is relatively small. The final thing I want to talk about today is just, again, to try and be as comprehensive as possible, social stories as another sort of common example of an intervention to support autistic learners. And it is, again, to develop routines or to prepare them for something new and unexpected, something markedly different. So social stories can be part of the general process of preparing a child for a change, for something new. We're going to a different school, we're going on holidays, we're going to, your grandparents' house, these sorts of things. So the idea is that we give them a visualization, we give them a script, a routine for them to engage with, familiarize themselves with, and therefore have an expectation and a plan for what to expect when it actually happens. So again, we have videos and the example. Going to a new school, which is not that surprising, or we're going to have a new teacher, or we're going to be starting doing PE outside, or we're going to start doing swimming. Any of those things. The idea, again, it's not visual structure, highlighting a new routine. This is what it's there for. There is evidence that it is used. There is not a huge body of evidence about its impact, but there's no evidence that it doesn't work. Well, thank you. It is lunchtime now.
Thank you.